As I mentioned, Dr. Sonit Bafna is Associate Professor and the Director of the Ph.D. program in Architecture at Georgia Tech. And his field of work is architectural morphology with a focus on space syntax. And the topic of his talk is the cognitively shaped environment, primer on descriptive methods. So please join me to welcome Dr. Bafna.
So good morning to everyone here, and good whatever time of the day is to all the people who are online. Thank you all for attending, and thank you Yasaman and Simin for putting this together. It was a lot of work, so I can sort of understand the tension you guys must be in. But anyway, we had a good beginning, and I'm going to sort of continue a little bit on from where Simin and Yasaman left us. I'm glad that they talked a little bit about the structure of the brain. And then Simin and then Yasaman has put my talk in the context of the whole conference. So just to remind you all, the main idea here was for the main interest we have is for understanding the relationship of humans in their environment, the way the behavior is shaped. And for a number of people, in a number of disciplines, this question comes up because people who sort of want to know what decisions they take in shaping the environment, what consequences they might have for people living within it. So this is something that I have found, for example, collaborating with people in various areas, obviously in psychology, but also in areas like, let's say, organizational theory. In architecture, of course, this is the central question for a lot of people. We want to design environments to predict certain kind of outcomes. So this is really a question that sort of cuts across many disciplines. And one of the stumbling blocks for a long time has been a relative inability to define the environment. What does it mean to say? What is really happening is we are looking for, and especially if you get your methods to be more refined, to give you slightly more precise answers, we are looking for ways in which you can differentiate parts of the environment from each other. So you can say there are certain qualities which are more present in either this environment or this kind of environment, and it's compared to the other one. And if you can have some ways of discriminating those things, then basically you are well on your way to using these methods. From there, you can build up all kinds of descriptions, qualitative descriptions, but you can also then start to think about quantitative differences that might be had in human outcomes and things like that. So the problem comes down to the idea of building up descriptive methods which allow us to discriminate different parts of the environment. Right? And that's the problem that I'm going to sort of talk about today. Certain techniques have been developed to do that. These techniques have been able to arrive not only at qualitative descriptions of the environment, how the environment might feel from each other or how it might function in terms of affecting our behavior, but also to some extent quantify it. And that was a bit of a surprising result. When I got into it as a young student, that is something that I did not expect, that you could actually differentiate different parts of the environment, create discrimination between different parts of the environment through actual numbers, through some metrics. Right? So let's see what kind of how that can be done. The work I'm describing falls under an area of architecture called architectural morphology, the study of shape in architecture. It started out by studying shapes of buildings, and then it took many different directions. The work mostly was inaugurated to a great extent in the United Kingdom, in London, but then there are other people who were studying similar ideas in different parts of the world at the urban scale. And all these were people who were calling themselves morphologists. And amongst them was a group of people in UCL London who developed a particular set of techniques and sort of initiated a very distinctive research program called space syntax. And so the thing I will talk about today mostly comes from the space syntax within this broad umbrella of architectural morphology. And my aim here is to obviously to show you some of these techniques. But what I would like to do is to somehow find a way to organize the different kind of techniques available to see why they have occurred. So we hope to really see the reasons behind these techniques as well. And then the other thing I want to do is to see that in answering these kind of techniques, we are able to answer not only how the environment may have effect on us, but also I think it gives us very good insights into the other aspect of the equation, which is how do we shape the environment? And this might seem an odd question because it seems like we shape the environments through our disciplines of architecture or building construction in direct ways, right? You decide what you want to do. But it turns out that environments are a little bit more like language, if they are natural at all, than simply like artifacts that we design. In other words, they have sort of structural features which constrain the way we can shape environments. So we shape the environments also to fit the mind much more than we shape them to fit our bodies, right? And that is the part I hope I will at least give you an insight to, and if not completely all the answers there. That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. Now, the way I'll describe it is my talk will be in 3 parts, and I'll go gradually from sort of understanding environments in very simple, very basic perceptual terms, and looking at what kind of structure you might find in it, to a little bit more social structure, where things like our social constraints become more important. So the simplest way you might look at an environment is basically you can think of environment as giving you information about what is out there, about what you can navigate, right? Simin just gave you a sense that there are specialized cells in our body that basically create maps of the environment. They pick up features of the environment and then use them, the cells relate to each other, and then basically what you have is what appears to be, although nobody can quite tell what, some kind of a cognitive mapping, some mapping of the environment is going on. And there are different things that we can map. We can map, for example, we know where we are with respect to a particular space. We know what direction we are looking in. And this is all the things, the grid cells and all these things that Simin has described, right? So we can try to capture some of that by basically saying what kind of information, so put the equation on the other side, what kind of equation does the environment give us, right? And one simple way to do it is to introduce a particular kind of, call it technique or a construct, called the isovist, right? In computer science, people will call it a visual polygon sometimes, or a visual field. There's different names for it. But it's a very simple idea. You stand in one place and you just plot out to what extent, what area of the floor is swept by your gaze as it goes around 360 degrees, right? And you create, in most environments which are restricted, like the environment I'm in right now, you create essentially a polygon that I can see. And you can see that clearly in the 3 diagrams on the left-hand side. So the black dot tells you where I am, your vantage point, and then the green shows you what's the shape of the polygon that I can see at this point. Now, this is interesting because the polygon has similar simple geometrical properties. It has a shape, it has a size, and it has other kinds of derivative properties. Like, for example, you might think of the spikiness of it. It might all be very compact, or it might be very spiky. And then there are further geometrical properties. You could think about to what extent it extends into the building. So the polygon on the left-hand side is a little bit more compact, doesn't extend very far. But as you change your positions a little bit within the same room, these are from a plan. I'll show you a little bit more where they are. You can see that suddenly you get your lines of sight shooting out quite to the ends of the space, right? Now, why are these interesting? Because all of them, there's a basic idea in psychology called affordance. They afford different kinds of opportunities for us. You can hide from people, you can see various people you are, you can put yourself in an exposed space. So you can think of what the isovist is offering you a set of affordances, and those affordances can be then a way of thinking about behavior. Like our behavior is very much tied to the kind of affordances that we have. Now, this idea can be enriched a little bit more if you study not individual isovists, but actually fields of isovists. So you can take these isovists, and the diagram on below, all the isovists have been plotted, and on a grid of, you can choose at any size you want. So for example, this was a very fine grid taken. I think in this case, the grid was about, half a meter, or I think even smaller. And then there's a grid imposed on it. And for every point in the grid, an isobist is calculated. And then the properties of the isobist can be represented, let's say, by color here. So this here, in this case, the properties of isobist that are shown are the size of the isobist. Yes, in this case, no. In this case, what is shown is the maximum extent that you can see. I'll show you again, of the isobist. And the 3 points that are shown there have been plotted on, interesting, on the points, on the ones that are seen above. But you can see there's the 3 points now fall under a kind of field of isovists, where if you move around, suddenly your isobist shapes will change in particular ways. Is it because I'm
no?
Okay. It's fine. We can explain. Okay. Now you can do this, and as you begin to do that, you can begin to sort of look at the way fields might change for a completely different plan. And now I can tell you a little bit about these two plans. Go forward. And say that they were both created by an architect over a period of, they're separated by a period of about 10 years, who was looking for new ways of designing buildings. And he came up with the idea that you don't always need to design buildings as collection of rooms, closed spaces, but basically as a landscape in which walls are deployed. And it took him about 4 or 5 years to fully develop this idea, which is still a kind of interesting historical architectural puzzle. So the one at the bottom was done in 1924, 23, and the other one was done in 29. And you might think both of them have similar ideas. In both cases, there are certain walls deployed, and the isovis will change accordingly. But in the first case, you might see there's a slight difference where the outer boundary is quite rigid, and the internal walls are deployed. In the second case, the outer boundary itself changes over time. So there are slight differences. And those differences and what it does to our perceptual isovis as you move around, you can capture first by the way the fields develop here, but also by the way you can study the distribution of these. The together house is the one on the top, the brick house is the one here. And you can see how the histograms of the isovis will tell you what your perception might be. So in this case, the histogram is a little bit more compact. All the isovis have smaller sizes, but here the range of values is much more spread out, and then you get some peaks and quite a few sort of, if you think of it, there's a little bit more kurtosis in these diagrams. Things are a little bit more spread out and with heavier tails, if you want to think like that. And that tells you that the experience of there will be a little bit more rich and varied in terms of the length of the isovis, whereas here, although there is a set of exciting spaces, the perception from room to room will remain the same. So already we are beginning to capture numerically and through distributions something that's quite intangible, the experience of feeling like you are moving in a flowing space with vistas changing all the time. Right? It's a simple idea. This can actually have consequences. So there's a study that a student of mine had done a few years ago, collaborating with a colleague, with a couple of colleagues in our department. And this person did her PhD with Professor Craig Zimmering, and we were discussing methods of capturing some of the ways in which, for example, these things can use to capture outcomes in, let's say, nursing setting and ICU settings. So in ICU settings, the issue is that patients need to be constantly monitored, and nurses actually have to have these dual tasks. They have to keep monitoring the patients that are assigned to them, but a good nurse in an ICU setting will also be alert to what else is happening on the ICU floor. So if there is some emergency somewhere, they can keep out. So if there was only one, the nurses would always be in their patient rooms. Sometimes they have more than one patient, so they have to go out of them. And they also want to keep track of the life in the ICU as a whole. So what we discovered was that one good way to capture this sense on the ability of the environment to provide this is to think of a concept called isovis connectivity. And isovis connectivity does two things. First, it plots a series of steps from the isovis out. So if you take the patient bed on the left-hand side right there, you can create the first isovis polygon that is seen from that, the dark gray area. And then the light gray area, the next light color, captures all the spaces that can be seen from the first isovis. And then the light area is when you go into that area, you can see further. So as you step out, you can gradually see the whole things in a series of steps. Everything becomes available to you. And what you can do is you can take the gray polygon and then basically look at all the vantage points in the gray polygon and take the average of what is available, or you can take medians depending on what you would like to do, or sum of all the isovis seen. And the red color, the colored diagram here shows you what is the isovis size from each of those polygons. If you can do that, you can calculate average amount of extent of the plan seen from within the gray area. And the idea is that anybody in that gray area will be able to see the patient, especially the patient head, but also keep track of what is happening outside there. So that gray area becomes the critical zone in which nurses can basically move to monitor both of them. And the isovis range of those should give you, the distribution of those should give you some measure of how effectively nurses can do this. And it turned out that in one of the studies, they studied patient records in 4 ICU settings, about 1,400 patients. And they were 40% too lower the odds of that if patients were in high ICU. things. Basically, the effect was that nurses were able to perhaps monitor. We can't establish causal relations, but at least we should show some association with that. So there are some benefits in certain selected areas where vision is particularly important in these kind of metrics. So that is one set of things. We measure very simple perceptual affordances or the fields of those affordances. But now comes a very interesting step. Because, and it's sort of an unexpected step that you can take. So right now, the basic unit that we had, the isovist was very rich in perceptual information. We could carry a number of different properties. I just showed you one or two kinds of those properties. But there are some other things you could do also. And in a way, you do something that is slightly odd, because instead of increasing the kind of properties you could do, you try to create these small units with very narrow range of almost maybe one unique property. Right? So when you do that, you beginning to basically, these properties can cluster into small areas. So if you look at the fields, you might see that there are zones in which isovist properties are very similar, and then it will change and it will go there. And those alert us to the fact, that kind of thing alerts us to the fact that our built environment doesn't randomly distribute isovist properties, it does that in clusters. So there's some kind of underlying structure there. And that underlying structure can create different kinds of spaces. So sometimes, and here is, I will tell you where the thing is taken from, but I just want to create, so what the diagram shows is a particular kind of isovist property that people call the point first moment. Essentially, it's a moment. If you think of isovist as a polygon will have a sense of inertia associated with it. So how far it would rotate given the way its mass is distributed around its centroid. And you can calculate that by simply adding up together all the lengths of the isovist of the points from the initial vantage point. And you do that, what it does is it gives you an index of the shape of the isovist, whether it's very broad and round or whether it is very elongated. And here you can begin to plot out. You can see that it's beginning to pick out all these long images. So these more reddish areas have very elongated isovists, and the more yellow areas have more rounded isovists. And the diagram shows that a lot of our buildings are organized in these two kinds of spaces. Some of them are very long, and some of them are very rounded. Right? And then you can do this funny step of saying, forget about isovists. I'll only focus on the way the round spaces are organized or the way long spaces are organized in the spaces. So you create maps that look like this. So you take a given plan, a layout with walls in it, and you can represent, and this is very easy to do in houses. You can take these kind of things and think of every room as an isovist, which would basically be yellow spaces in that diagram, very rounded spaces. But now you ignore the isovist in that. You simply say all these things have very similar isovists. They belong to a block together. Right? So each space belongs to a block together. And so basically you resolve the house into a system of connected convex spaces. And what are the units? The convex spaces are basically in any space, everything is available to you visually at a time. So now you've simplified the isovist into something called the convex space, and you removed a lot of perceptual properties from it. The only property left is visual information. You just see a rounded space. But now what is interesting is you study not so much the property of the unit itself, but the way that unit relates to other units. And you can represent that, in this case, simply by a graph, because the units have one relationship to each other. You can either go from one unit to another, or you cannot. So with one relationship and one kind of unit, you can begin to create graphs. And you can also create other kinds of units, slightly less natural in environments like this, more natural in cities, but basically or buildings with corridors where you can take lines and basically think of every line as having a perceptual unit. I can walk and see, I have information available with me, and I can see connections of lines that tells you a little bit of what kind of walking path might look like. So I get a different kind of graph from there. So in a plan, you can get these two graphs. And now what you have done, because you have removed all the properties, you're only interested in relational properties. It turns out that these relational properties first allow you in very interesting metrics. You can either count the number of spaces. So you can say, oh, space 1 has three neighbors, space 10 has 4 neighbors, 4 connections, the line here. Or for example, you can say the bedroom here has only one neighbor, one access point to it. Or you can count network distances, even more interesting. I can say from an outside, I need to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 successive doors in order to go to that particular bedroom. Right? And all these properties have social consequences. We know that depth maps into privacy. We know that depth maps into, for example, if it's a jail, the security, amount of security might have. Depth also might map onto dignity or status. People with very senior positions have deeper offices in some days. So you can sort of begin to think about many social things. And it's a funny move you've taken. You've removed isolated some of the perceptual qualities, but that allows you to see that underlying structure in the way the spaces are organized. So that is what you can do. And now it's an example of where this might come through. So we were studying with a colleague in an organization. We were studying as an office building, a design office. And you can see that we created various kinds of measures, in this case by the axial lines. But we also calculated something that is called entropy. So entropy basically tells you as you move around through a set of vantage points, parts of the building are revealed to you. And in some rooms, the more you go out, you will take more steps to see everything else. In other cases, suppose you are in the center of the building, you see a lot first. And by the time you've taken 2 or 3 steps, very little is being revealed. So you can capture that difference. Again, following the basic information theory entropy formula, you can do that. And then combining all these things together, you can now compare interesting spaces. So one question they had was, how are we doing on time? So one question they had was that in this office setting, 2 kinds of spaces had been created in order to, basically the intention was to promote mixing of people and maybe to promote solidarity or things like that. And what they had done was, there's a theory now in organizational sciences that suppose you create what are called free spaces in organization, which are not tied to your work or your status, that will open up for casual interactions and other kinds of things. So they had created a cafe that you see here, and they had created a room here for, they call it a game room there, where there were things where you could do some exercise. And the idea was people would do, but also talk a little bit about their work, or essentially socializing in these areas. And it turned out that these 2 spaces from our properties behave very differently. So what you have plotted here is the collected isovist of this space. So anybody in these yellow lines will be able to see into this space, but you can see that collected isovist goes far deep into the building. The collected isovist of those spaces goes very little. And you can also look at the properties of these spaces. I can go back a little bit and seeing where they are. So you can see, for example, that this one has a kind of medium level entropy, but a little bit high. That game room there has much lower entropy there. So it feels a little bit more cut off from everybody else. Or you can go back again, and the axial lines, you can see that the axial lines which are the closest to everything else, the mean depth, those go right through the system, whereas the axial lines that passes through there are sort of deeper into the system. So if you put all these together, you begin to find something that, you're beginning to explain something that discovered, which was that the cafe was very successful. These are the comments they collected from the people. They said, I do not think there are certainly groups throughout the office that work together, but the cafe does bring people together, but people come in and stay and talk about it. So lots of signs that the cafe was a success, and this was also observed. But the game room, people resisted going to it and using it. So people say it never gets really used. And somebody else is saying many people have the impression if someone sees me as this, they think I'm working, but I'm. So people had conflicting emotions about using it. And a lot of the distribution of those properties begin to give us an insight into why those kind of things are happening. Right? So there are, again, direct consequences of measuring these kind of properties because they have, it seems to be, again, no, these are not causal relations, but we can see that there is some association with the success of certain kind in the buildings. Now we have sort of seen, and this is really where a lot of work in syntax has gone. They have developed these kind of metrics, and there are a lot of studies which have, there's a huge amount of studies people have done, where basically they have collected metrics or spatial metrics, and they're able to find correlations or create models in which these are user explanatory models. Yet, one interesting thing about these methods, and this is the third thing I will cover, is that these methods, if you've seen, especially in the last one where we were reducing buildings to collections of either convex maps or axial lines, or sometimes even vantage points, these are a little bit agnostic to the provenance of these things. Are they really convex maps in space? Sometimes the convex maps are easy to do in the example I showed because every room is clearly defined. But if you take a Mies example, the one that I showed you for my isovist, you might not know exactly what's a convex map, what space is convex. You might get overlapped spaces sometimes, right? So but these methods are a little bit agnostic towards it. They don't care what the actual nature or status of these things are. They're created as analytical techniques, right? But maybe there should be something, if you think of buildings as having these things, do such kind of discretized spaces, do they have any reality to it? We know a little bit they would do because often these convex spaces, suppose you do, are basically associated with labels. Say, oh, that's a living room or bedroom. So we know that in some cases they work at that. And in urban environments, sometimes these spaces basically have these kind of they're associated, for example, the state lines are associated with major streets. So street label names correspond to that. So we want to keep that in mind and ask for that. But before we do that, I want to point out one more property of these spaces, which is that they are capturing parts of the movement. But what is interesting to notice is they capture, number one, they capture effects of space. So before that, we had started by saying that the isobase tries to relate movement to something that is very explicit and available to you in affordance. I can see outside, so I know that if I'm in this area and I'm in this corner, it affords me a lot of surveillance, right? Or if I go into a corner instead, it affords me hiding. I could do that. But as we go towards the more more sort of the relational methods, the relational means, the graphs, we are beginning to capture what are known, what we could call the latent effects of space. I might not know that my street there is the most central in the space, but through use, it will somehow come to have an effect on me. So that is one of the gains we get out of these methods. They allow us to think of properties of space that people themselves may not be aware of, right? And that was the example with our cafe. People didn't know why the cafe was not working, but certain graphical properties, certain relational properties were working and explaining that. The other thing is that key thing to remember is that we are now thinking about the influence of behavior not on immediate things. Just because I see this and I see a person there, I can hide from them at a minute if I don't want to meet them. But we are not talking about those incidental behavior things. We are talking about behaviors that we change over time. So basically, the word we would like to use is that they talk about capturing the adaptation of behavior. So over time, a kind of pattern of behavior sets in, and that pattern is what ultimately we would like to study. So this idea of latent effect of space and understanding not just casual or incidental behavior, but adapted, but more sort of systemic behavior is what we are trying to get at. And one good example of where they have studied this, for example, is in urban areas where this has happened a lot. So people are beginning to find, for example, this is a work taken from one of my colleagues' studies. I don't do that much work in urban areas, but they were able to create a metric of space. I will not describe that, called reach. And these tell you how great or small that is in Atlanta. And I can move this. Right. It can basically, the reach is plotted on the x-axis, and the number of encounters that people have while walking around. And they were collected basically by people walking in this path and noting down the number of people they met over time. There seems to be a very strong correlation between them, right? So this tells you that the number of people you'll find is not taken into account what the function of the space is so much. Even if you ignore everything else, if you just take into account the relational properties, you can begin to see certain kind of observed patterns. These are consistent over time. And so these are what we mean by adaptive behaviors. Over time, people have learned how to operate in a city like this. But now we come back to the final problem, which is, can we think a little bit about the provenance of these units? Are the units just, you can create many kinds of ways of creating graphs in the buildings. Should we keep on doing that? Are all of them the same? Or should we go for methods which talk a little bit about giving some meanings to the individual units created? And one way we create those kind of units is through social things. We are all social beings. So far, we have thought about the relationship has been mostly at a psychological level, the individual in the space, what they are able to see and what they are able to do. But actually, we define space for social reasons. We create spaces where we can move. So one good way to combine these kind of very psychologically, cognitively shaped cognitive understanding of the environment with social things is to perhaps define the units with a little more sociological sense. And how much time do I have?
We have half an hour.
Okay, so I'll go. I should be wrapping up in 10 minutes. So the reason I asked is because I'm going to take a little bit of a detour and give you a sense of in what way we can address this issue of of behavior, of giving some kind of a sense of social realism to the units that we are constructing, the discrete units we are constructing. One set of answers really comes from work in ecological psychology. A lot of work was done in the last 20, 30, 50 years ago, maybe. So a socially inclined psychologist called Roger Barker basically found when they were studying behavior and the role of relation of the environment to the behavior, that our behavior actually is not so much indiscriminate, but quite patterned. We repeat the same activities we do from time to time. Most of our lives are much more patterned than we think perhaps they are. But not only they are patterned in time, they're also patterned in space. We go to the same spaces a number of times, right? And these people were studying, they went to one town and they were trying to record, quite amazingly, all the activities possible in that whole town. And they realized that activities happen in particular restricted areas. In those restricted areas, what they observed were standing patterns of behavior. At a given particular rhythm of intervals, same things would be seen happening. If you go to a classroom, there's a class happening at a regular interval. If you go to an office, people are doing similar kinds of things at a particular time. These areas are a little bit circumscribed. The activities that happen with them are sort of isolated from the other activities in the sense that people like us, we are having a thing together. We are not so much concerned with what is happening. We have created a small isolation. And there is, more interestingly, a correlation between the shape of the activity and the shape of the space we are in. Right? So all these features basically gave them a feeling that there was a kind of real thing to it. This was not something that you casually observe, that we live our activities in very restricted, small-scale environments, and which we do repeated activities. And they call this thing a behavior setting. And perhaps we could think of the units of space that whose relational characters we are thinking about as being behavior settings of this kind. Now we could do it, and I'm going to show you a little bit what the result of that would be. But before that, let me give you a sense of how it have emerged historically. We don't often study historical emergence of buildings in architecture. All our architecture starts 2,000 years ago, our history of architecture. But I want to go maybe 4,000 years ago and study when original buildings came up. And I want to talk to you a little bit about work, obviously not I have done, but a number of archaeologists have done, anthropologists who are studying sort of very old societies. And every society they find there's a feature in which societies go from building very small single-celled dwellings, which are connected together in clusters in what area, in places that people call compounds, to basically creating villages. And this happens, they've observed, this has been observed to happen in various cultures at different times, but the pattern always remains the same. There's a period in which there is one kind of settlement, and then very rapidly it gives rise to another kind. The diagrams I'm showing are from the work of a worker, an anthropologist called Brian Bird, who for many years, he published this in 2005, but the work was obviously a few decades older than that. This is just one example of a study, but this example comes from a place called Beta in Jordan, where they were able to find, because of the environment, very good relics of the past. And they discovered two phases of pattern, actually four, but they broke them into two phases. So you can see in this phase, there are lots of small dwellings like this. And in this phase, you can see very much dense dwellings begin to occur. And this initial thing gives us a sense of how our buildings are socially organized, that part will come. So what happens in these things is, in the quick example of what kind of dwellings they found. So here is a reconstruction, this is their reconstruction on the side of a dwelling from the first phase. And in the background, you can't quite see is a dwelling from the second phase, with this funny honeycomb structure. What we see here is these properties. I'm summarizing a very sort of more extensive argument very quickly. So in the first pattern, they were single-celled houses. They were much smaller. You can see that the shape are about 2 meters. They're large rooms, but they are meant for often, if not individuals, very small families. And they cluster together. There's a lot of sign of activity outside the thing. So a lot of cooking or something would happen outside. So, and not much activity or work done inside. And then these things formed a compound area. So very relatively unstructured organization. And then very rapidly over time, these things shifted over to an organization like this, and then it stays permanent over this time. What happens here? Very interesting things began to develop. The rooms get bigger and they become multicellular. They become more densely packed to each other. Both the rooms within the house, but also houses next to each other. And you can begin to see long spaces, streets beginning to emerge. You can see those clearly there. So their streets are beginning to emerge. You also see an example of a larger building. You don't see anything like that here. A kind of the sense that there's a corporate structure, there is some governance, some common thing. It could be a gathering place, meeting place, or it could be a sacred space. We don't know. More interestingly, they are finding that inside these are now examples of work being done. So labor and everything has been privatized. This was, according to some people, these societies are risk-sharing societies. So if they are, let's say, storing grain for the bad weather, they will do it in open areas. They're a little bit less hierarchical. Maybe there's a headman, but there is no sense of continuity from one generation to another. And there's less privacy here. People sort of live together. They only live in small bands, about 40 people, 50, can't go bigger than that. Here, things get much bigger. There's an example of hierarchy emerging. That's why you have these cognitive structures. And the hierarchy is maintained by status of the houses. Some are bigger, some are smaller. You can see those things here. This is all the houses they found. They have been, and this is my graphs of all the spaces inside all the houses. And you can begin to see that there's a kind of tree-like structure that begins to emerge in all these patterns. There's a single space and then it branches out. And this seems to be the seeds for what we think are modern buildings. They are made up of small discrete spaces which are connected together. And each space is allocated distinctive activities. When you see the remains in these things, some of them you can see burns out remains because they were doing sorting, chipping stones, or something like that. Some of the activities were some other activities. So you can see there's a differentiation of activity within the home. These are different behavior settings, if you want to call that. And the home itself is a larger collection of behavior settings. So what we are seeing this, right from the historical times, are buildings have emerged as collection of small discrete spaces. Not only that, when you take those things as the core now, they're not just any convex space, but specific behavior settings, space, labeled rooms, you want to call it that, you are now beginning to see remarkable patterns and constraints on the way we shape our buildings. So here are three examples of buildings. There's a museum. It's in China right now, done by an architect. Actually, the Liangzhou Museum done by Chipperfield. There is one of the Miesian houses, and this is a hospital, a kind of a small hospital, North Georgia. All of them, we have modeled them simply because we were able to get details. We have each node represents not just a convex space, but basically a labeled space, like this room would be a labeled space. And you can begin to see few interesting things if you look at buildings of different sizes. First, they are relatively flat. The number of spaces here is maybe 10 times more than the number of spaces here. And yet the number of levels, this is from the entrance, and then you go down further. You go there, the kind of graphs we had constructed before, you can see that everything is within 4 steps here. Museum also has about 4 steps, and the house also about 3 or 4 steps. So the range goes between 4 and 7 steps. So buildings are flat. There's a self-similarity to the organization. There are lots of trees, and you can see it's a tree of trees, if you would think like that. Right? And then the other thing is that there are some rings also. So trees are when you have one node that branches into many nodes, and that keeps on branching. So if you have to go from one place to another, you have to go back again to the common node and go out. But sometimes you can you go from one node to another, creating a ring. If I opened a door outside, for example, this would complete the ring and I could go out. All the rings occur near the entrance areas. So houses are patterned, all our buildings are patterned where the rings are mostly in the upper areas. They're large circuits, and then there are trees which go deeper. That's quite remarkable because it says for all the variety of buildings we have produced, and we have been studying it through history, this kind of pattern remains very consistent. We don't just arbitrarily put rooms together, we put them in this particular kind of order. And any behavior we have will be tuned not simply to perceptual qualities and all the kind we have discussed, it's also tuned to this kind of social organization of buildings that's reflected here. And I'll just finish that part, and I will go one example where I found something interesting to do with that. and then I'm done with my talk. So we were studying some houses. We were studying some buildings in a Latino community in Brooklyn area. But they had interviewed about 300 people there, about 400 people, but we got data finally from about 300 people. And we were interested in seeing if there was a relationship between the shape of the apartments they were living in and some health outcomes. And especially we were interested in mental health outcomes. And one of the things we tried out, we said we should look at, is if the organization of the rooms has an effect on the mental outcomes, apart from other things. So one way we tested to clarify this is there are two ways that architects have had this century in designing houses. You would create cluster of spaces, and one space becomes a central space, and then there are branches of it. You can see a living room connects to many here, and in this case, a dining room connects to a number of spaces here. So these two spaces are basically what we call living centered. The space that connects to everything that is closest from all the rooms is basically centered is some living area, either a dining room or a living room, or it could be a kitchen. It could obviously be a bedroom. In some other areas, a corridor, this is a more modern kind of thing that starts in the 50s, the corridor will connect everything. If you've lived in a mid-century house, the corridors are at the center of everything. If you split the whole pattern into two of them, very interesting things begin to happen. Here is a diagram that shows number of males and females and the rates of depressions. These were not actual depression. These are propensities for a depression based on a questionnaire that are given to them. So the propensity of females is greater than males. That is normal. That's what is expected often. But if you split this data into two parts, into those people who are living in living-centered houses and those in the circulation-centered, you'll see that the proper males' depression rates actually even fall. They don't change much. But the females are much more likely to be depressed in circulation-centered houses than the male ones. And then if you do a full model, a logistic model here, which plots these things. So these are the confidence intervals of each of the terms that I introduced. You can see that there are two areas where the females obviously have greater chance of things, but females living in interaction term, the center type with females, has a much lower odds of depression. The depressions are lowered for them. And actually the ratio is that if these are on log scale confidence intervals, but if you plot it out to the actual scale, the odds of women being depressed compared to women in living-centered, of being women's circulation-centered compared to living-centered, increased by 3.4 to 1.7. So you can see that there is appreciable difference, at least in the data that we have from the estimates that we can collect. Right. So studying buildings in this way, it again begins, you can think about the latent effects that these kind of measures might begin to have on health. Obviously, this is one study. You don't want to make too much out of it. There are other factors that could have come into play. But these are all indicators, I feel. Nothing is established. They're indicators that these kind of metrics are beginning to basically find some correlations with some. And that's all. I just want to wrap up, finally saying that give you a sense of things. So I've given you a sense of how these measures might be created conceptually and what kind of implications they might have. How would you actually create them? The issue is that creating these graphical metrics is very tedious. If you want to do it manually, it is very tedious, very time consuming. So people have developed different software for doing it. At our institute, we have developed a set of software. So today you will get a sense of how they are going to be developed. So a couple of people working with me will present some of the techniques there, their in-house software they've developed. Plus, they've been exploring with ideas of using them in other kinds of, for example, things may be simulated. So agent-based simulations may also help in that. So all this is a little bit of what you will get a little bit later. Sorry, I took a longer time than I expected, but I'm here to take questions.
Thank you, sir.